Now let's look at 4 examples to get some ideas relating to hypothesis testing. Our null hypothesis, HO, states Mrs. Borlaug is young. Our alternate then is Mrs. Borlaug is not young. Our data is Mrs. Borlaug's birthday cake with so many candles that they had to call the fire department. If HO is true, would the data be ordinary or unusual? We want to look at the data and decide if it's ordinary or unusual. In this case, having so many candles on the cake that you needed the fire department would be unusual. And since it's unusual, we would think something was up for that to occur if both statements were true. Therefore, would we reject or do not reject? We would reject HO. The sentence will be written in terms of the alternate hypothesis. And since we reject HO, that means we will accept H1. There is evidence to say that Mrs. Borlaug is not young. Our HO is that Mrs. Borlaug owns a boat. Mrs. Borlaug does not own a boat, then becomes our alternate. Our data is that Mrs. Borlaug owns a truck. Now, many people who own a boat also own trucks. But if HO is true, would the data be ordinary or unusual? Well, it's ordinary. Lots of people own trucks. Lots of people with boat own trucks. So if HO is true, this still would be ordinary data. Because it is ordinary data, would we reject HO or do not reject HO? Well, we could not reject the HO. It does not cause us to reject the null, therefore we cannot accept H1. So we do not reject HO. And in our sentence, which is the sentence needs to be written in terms of the alternate hypothesis, so we do not have enough evidence to say anything. Therefore, there is not enough evidence to say that Mrs. Borlaug does not own a boat. Remember that we always write our sentence in terms of the alternate hypothesis. HO, Mrs. Borlaug is afraid of heights. H1, Mrs. Borlaug is not afraid of heights. This time, the data is Mrs. Borlaug is on her vacation and we have a vacation picture. Notice that she's carrying her math homework. If HO is true, Mrs. Borlaug is afraid of heights, would the picture be ordinary or unusual? Well, if the statement is true, the picture would be unusual. And if it's unusual, would that mean that we should reject HO or do not reject HO? That means we should reject HO. The sentence will be written in terms of the alternate hypothesis. Therefore, there is evidence to say that Mrs. Borlaug is not afraid of heights. HO says it is Mrs. Borlaug's birthday today, and H1 says it is not Mrs. Borlaug's birthday today. Mrs. Borlaug is going shopping today. Many people go shopping on their birthday. If HO is true, it is Mrs. Borlaug's birthday today, would the data be ordinary or unusual? Well, going shopping is not unusual. Therefore, it is ordinary. and we cannot reject HO. Many people do go shopping on their birthday, so we cannot reject HO. So we do not reject HO. And the sentence will be written in terms of the null alternate hypothesis. The sentence is written in terms of the alternate hypothesis. So there is not enough evidence to say that it is not Mrs. Borlaug's birthday today. The null hypothesis, the alternate hypothesis, are based on defined risks that you will never be able to prove the null hypothesis. You can never prove the null hypothesis. You can only prove the alternate hypothesis, H1, if the data gives you enough evidence to reject the null HO. You can only prove the alternate hypothesis H1 if the data gives you enough evidence to reject the null hypothesis HO. You can prove the alternate hypothesis if HO is rejected. So to have any chance of proving something, you must put it in the alternate hypothesis. But contracts seem to always have fine print, and the fine print is, unfortunately, with just a sample, it is impossible to prove something is equal to a value. So equals must go in the null hypothesis. All equals go into the null. Review. Circle the correct answers. HO is the null, H1 is the alternate. Never say accept HO or never say reject HO. We never say accept HO because the beta risk will be undefined. In statistics, you only want to say things that have a low risk of being wrong. If the data is unusual when the null hypothesis is true, there is evidence to say with a certain level of risk, I reject HO. Rejecting the null hypothesis, HO, is the same as accepting the alternate hypothesis, H1. If the null hypothesis HO is rejected, then the appropriate sentence in terms of the null hypothesis is, there is evidence to say that H1 is true. If the data is ordinary when the null hypothesis HO is true, then there is not evidence to reject HO, and you say, I do not reject HO. If the null hypothesis HO is not rejected, then the appropriate sentence in terms of the null hypothesis is, there is not enough evidence to say H1 is true. The next slide is the summary of the steps you will learn in a future session. The steps that we will learn to do in a future session are: 1. Set up the hypothesis, the null and the alternate hypothesis, and put what you want to prove in H1. But remember that the equals must go into HO. Unfortunately, you can never prove equals with just a sample. Define the critical region using the alpha risk. 3. Use data to find the test statistic. Based on the data, reject HO or do not reject HO, and compare the test statistic with the critical value. Write a sentence in terms of H1. We will complete these 5 steps in the next video. You are now ready for the next video on hypothesis testing. I hope this video was helpful. Thank you for watching.